Okay, so to start off, I want to give a shout out. It's to a channel called Yours Truly. I'll annotate in the comments section and the description below. Now, first off, I have no association with this individual. We're not friends. I don't even know if he likes me, because lately there seems to be a lot of people who don't. I'm never going to mention a channel unless it's in praise. So in this situation, Yours Truly had said something that makes a lot of sense, and I want you guys to understand this. He had basically said that a pivot, if you understand this, has to have some play. All bushings, all systems of pivots have to offer some form and amount of blade play, because it's a folder, and if there was no blade play, no movement allowed, then it wouldn't open. There would be no ability for it to move. So if you understand that, then the amount of it, though, is then those tolerances. How much movement is tolerated by that tightness and that pivot and that design side. Now, so I had seen this video though, and it was talking about the quality of blade centering, perhaps seen among some knives compared to perhaps other knives. And in this instance, I'm going to specifically focus on a Strider pivot, a Sebenza pivot, and a Spyderco pivot. And at least in this situation, that would be right now a Stage 2 pivot as an example. But it does pertain to other Spyderco pivots in which you see two male screws. Okay, so if you're talking about blade centering, that's what this video is going to be about. Okay, you can't compare these two on here on a different level than this. They're completely different. These are males and females. Okay, this is not. You see, there's actually no way that you can't center a sage. There's no reason you wouldn't be able to center it. And that's because, if you remember, I had shown this, but if you tighten one side, look at the centering. Okay? You see that? You can adjust it. So, same goes for the other side. You create a certain amount of tension on each side that keeps the blade center, but allows it to open and not have blade play. Simple. And that's something that only Spyderco can do, you see, because now here's the next thing, you guys gotta understand this. See, Spyderco is mass producing, and whether or not they have an ability to cast the scales in a certain shape, or because they're mass producing, they're able to machine custom made parts. But if you look at this, there is a notch. Okay, do you see that little straight line? That is keeping that pivot in place. Okay, now that's something you don't see on a Strider or on a Sebenza or on most custom knives like Hinderers and his standoffs, and that's because they don't machine mass production. They can't cast this scale with that little slot right there to hold that middle tube in place. Warren Thomas, he uses the same method though. He uses two males and a female, so he can always center it. Now when you look at these then, okay, you look at perhaps the quality of manufacturing, a Sebenza is totally different now. Because a Sebenza is made, not that mass produced as you would think. I mean, it's produced in large amounts, but it's still made in the custom knife maker way, just like how Tough Thumbs does something. Like if you look at this, for example, you go in here and you see this, a Sebenza pivot, the female, you see it's not slotted, it can spin in place. Basically, look, it can move. Okay, and that's because Chris Reeve can only drill a hole. Anything that drills a hole is going to drill a circular shape. It has to spin in place to get through. Now, people compare, for example, and they'll say like a Strider, they'll say, man, it's not centered. Okay, and that's kind of funny, like, to me. I mean, that makes no sense, to say that, because there's a pros and cons here. I mean, a Strider, and I still haven't had my tour of the Strider shop, but I've been around enough knife makers to the point of, and talking with them and seeing the machining side and the making side, to know that, it's not that simple. For example, like Tough, when he does this titanium scale, I mean, by hand he is drilling a hole into this, and that hole can be off just ever so slightly, an angle, a tilt, just slightly, that you could shift the pivot. And in this sense, a Sebenza has an advantage over a Strider because a Sebenza has that bushing. You can't compare a Sebenza to a Strider because the pivots are not the same. The Sebenza has, what makes it famous is that little pivot bushing. And that bushing is what determines the space between the two scales, that little piece that we had seen before, which is right here. The Strider doesn't have that. What the Strider has is bulk and durability, but it's a simple male and female. And it's obvious what happens. I mean, if you screw one side, then it's going to shift the blade. So I mean, it's not something that you should look at and blame perhaps the blade centering. That is kind of the pros and cons of that type of pivot. It has its pros. It's less parts. It's strong. It's durable. Okay, it's bulky. But the cons is, you know, you can't go in there and tweak it like you can in Spyderco, and you can't go in there and you don't have a machined bushing in there to keep the spaces there, especially since the Strider doesn't have a stop pin in there to hold it like the Sage 2 does to create the space similarly matching to the Sebenza. So I mean, you have to think about that. Like, is Strider poor quality manufacturing? You know, this is a titanium scale made by Tough. He made this on his SNG, you know, did it by hand, okay, with hand tools. Then he mails it to me, and I take it and put it on a random Strider that he's never touched, which is mine, which is like a Frankenstein of knives. And the knife can sit not perfect, but darn close. And you have to realize these little minute differences, you know, that create this amount of uncentering are so minute that, like, first of all, that's insane craftsmanship on Tough's part, considering, like I say, he's doing it by hand. And then that's really good, how you say, universal quality on Strider's part. If I can do that, have a custom knife maker make a scale, mail it to me, and put it on a brand new knife that he's never touched, and have it be centered. You know what I'm saying? And the rest of the tolerances can be adjusted by these screws, and I can probably push it into place anyway. I mean, so to me, that it is good quality. That does show good quality control. And the Sebenza is the same way. You know, so if you say, like, okay, well, you know, your Sebenza is not centered, okay? You understand, like, quality here, it's different because it's a different level of manufacturing. There's more that goes into a Sebenza. A Sebenza has more machining, more parts. You guys know me. I'm not like, you know, kind of some kind of Chris Reeve supporter. But I can still at least acknowledge that there is a certain level of craftsmanship that deserves, like, that has merit, that deserves respect. I mean, I can see it. You know, I can understand, you know, the difficulty to do what Chris Reeve does to make this work. I mean, as I test my knives, and these are just my experiences, you know, and I see other lockups give out, or, you know, other things happen, this is still very impressive. I mean, you can't compare. So what does that mean? A Sage 2, yeah, a Sage 2 is a good design. That's a good design choice, you know, to make a pivot like that. But that's something only you can do if you're Spyderco. You know, maybe Chris Reeve could do that, but then it wouldn't be a Sebenza pivot. It wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't have that smooth, you know, consistent. It wouldn't have that bushing. I wouldn't be able to put it back together the way I just did. So I mean, it's just a total different. You know, I don't know if the Sebenza fans are going to be happy by me making this video, because I'm basically backing up Chris Reeve here. But I mean, this is a total different level of precision that has to be maintained. This virtually takes no precision. A machine makes the parts, a person puts it together, tightens it on each side until it's centered, and you think you've got this great quality control. You know, no, I mean, this takes an insane amount of measuring to do this right. I mean, that's why it costs so much. I mean, and then for the Strider, same thing. I mean, it's limited by its type of pivot. Logically speaking, a person should look at a Strider and say, you know what, okay, because of the type of pivot it is, the centering is going to be, you know, perhaps more hit or miss. There's going to be more variation in it, you know, and that's to be understood because of the type of pivot it is. A Sebenza, you know, is a lot of precise machining and measuring, but it's going to be centered because it has that bushing in there to help it. And then a Sage, if it isn't centered, should be easily recentered because of the way the bushing is created, the pivot's created. So you can't really compare them. It's not that the Sage Taichung Taiwan made stuff is better than the US made stuff. It's at a different level. You know, this is mass produced, this is custom world. You know, and this custom world uses a different style of pivots, and they do it for a reason, because these are custom knife makers. They choose females for a reason. You know, and you know, you can't really compare that. It's not a difference in quality control in terms of centering and precision. It's a difference in design. I mean, whether or not a blade is centered or not has no effect on its performance. It might change how early or late it locks up, you know, because of how this could be angled more this way or that way because of how the blade is tilted. But generally speaking, I mean, blade centering doesn't really have that large an effect on its performance. I mean, it's still going to open, it's still going to close, it's still going to lock. I mean, it pertains to that knife, that purpose of that knife, that design again. I mean, you know, like I said, I mean, I know a couple people who pick on the blade play, but you have to understand it's within those limits of those designs. I mean, if blade play is that big of an issue, then perhaps a female and male simplified pivot, you know, is not your way to go, because you're never going to have that maybe, you know, because there's going to need to be some blade play in order for it to work as a folder. You know, it has to give somewhere in here so that it can spin and close and move. So I mean, it's sort of like they are folders, you know, and there's limits, and you look at that and evaluate them for what they are. Thank you.